We intend to make sure that we minimise the impact of coronavirus on the poorest kids in this country. And one of the best ways in which we could do that, by the way, Mr. Speaker, would be to encourage all kids who can go back to school now because their schools are safe. Last week I asked him whether he would say publicly that schools were safe to go back to. He hummed and he hawed. Now's his time to say it clearly. Schools are safe to go back to. Mr. Speaker, your witness.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister obviously hadn't got the first idea what the Social Mobility Report actually said last week, a government body, and he talks to me about consistency and U-turns. The government's had 3 U-turns in the last month. First we had immigration health charges, then we had MPs voting, and then we had free school meals. The only question now is whether U-turns at the dispatch box before or after. 3 U-turns. He argues about one brief one week and one the next. He's an expert in that.
The specifics of that schools angle, because I felt, and you may disagree on this, but I felt that Boris Johnson got the better of Keir Starmer on that. The average voter, the average punter doesn't really care that Prime Minister's questions is supposed to involve the Prime Minister asking the questions. Answering the questions, not asking them. I mean, it is against convention, if you like, for him to insist that the leader of the opposition respond to his questions, but I don't think that matters. I mean, it's not an actual foul. You're not going to get a yellow card or a red card, even though it's against the spirit of the game. Your own fans are going to cheer it to the rafters, but I don't know whether it works or not. I know why he's done it. You know why he's done it, whether you are susceptible to this sort of nonsense or whether you find it as ridiculous as I do. We all know that it's about blame. Here is something going wrong. Clearly the government's fault, but we're going to try and blame it on somebody else. You can't really blame the chaos in our schools at the moment on immigrants, although there's probably a couple of people who'd try. You can't really blame it on Muslims. You can't blame it on single mothers at the moment or on people who've got too many children, although, again, there's probably a couple of people who'd try that. So what's left? What's left in the locker for really lazy right-wing commentators who think you're as thick as mince? Answer: trades unions. So you blame it all on trades unions. Down with the unions, you see. And it works in some quarters. I don't think you are thick as mince, but sometimes it's very hard to hear the voices of people who think that you're bright enough to see through this rubbish. We're bombarded with an almost unleavened diet of commentators and columnists who do think you're as thick as mince. And that is the bit I don't quite get about Keir Starmer's response. I mean, is this cutting through? I don't think Johnson would have gone back to it unless it was focus grouping well. Everything he does is based upon self-interest and focus groups. The notion of principle left the building shortly after he was born. So what's the game there? I don't get it, and I don't understand why Starmer fluffed it. You just say, of course schools should reopen when they're safe, but it's not for you to decide when they're safe. It's for teachers and head teachers to decide when they're safe. And the idea that schools should reopen when Parliament hasn't, I mean, there just seemed to me to be so much that Starmer could have come back on. He could have read out the government's own guidance. He could have asked about teachers wearing face masks on public transport on the way to work on pain of a fine and then being compelled to take them off when they get to work. I don't get that. That was weird. I wonder, and we'll turn to Theo in 43 seconds, I wonder whether Starmer struggles a bit with stuff that wouldn't be permissible in court. You know, stuff that wouldn't sway a jury. The points where a judge would say, actually, Mr. Starmer, please focus on you're not allowed to bring in emotive, rabble-rousing responses. You have to focus on facts when you're in court. I don't know, but of course Johnson is brilliant at the opposite of facts. He's brilliant at stoking up feelings. So give me a call from the perspective, you please. I'm very, very interested, though, in whether you think the school stuff cuts through. Do you sit at home somehow thinking that Keir Starmer bears responsibility for schools not reopening, despite being the leader of the opposition rather than the leader of the government? Is it working? And is it just the usual lazy demonisation of trades unions, whose job is to protect their members? And if their members aren't safe in the House of Commons, why would they be safe in a primary school?
Perhaps Keir Starmer is too honest, and he's only hitting Boris Johnson with what he thinks is acceptable in his mind. He doesn't want to score political points here. I think Keir Starmer is perhaps too principled. Now, I hope that's not the case. I think in Parliament you need to get down dirty, you need to get down in the mud, and you need to punch, even below the belt sometimes. Are we starting to see cracks appear in Keir Starmer? I hope that's not the case. I hope that he's playing 4D chess with us, and especially playing 4D chess with Boris Johnson. Perhaps by not taking a position on this issue, he's protecting himself in the long term. And I think it projects a type of weakness and he appears too calculated. I don't think this is what the public want to hear. They want to hear someone pick a side and defend that side. Boris Johnson is allegedly taking the side of, yes, we need to reopen the schools. Now, of course, I think this is a bad idea because the R number is increasing, the number of new cases has not been suppressed sufficiently, and the number of deaths per day is still quite high. Now, officially, the government are saying that they're reopening the schools because it's safe. I believe it's because they realize that there's no childcare mechanism in place. There are no resources in place for parents, and schools represent a type of childcare. And if parents are going back to work, then it means that the children have to go somewhere. And instead of the government actually investing in childcare, it's much cheaper just to force parents to send their kids back to school, unless we're talking about Eton. Now, once again, Keir Starmer dodging this issue projects a type of weakness on his part. But he could have said something like, what does the science say? Let's get the data from the SAGE committee, have it presented in Parliament so that we can actually make better decisions. However, I feel that Keir Starmer understands at the moment there is a sense of lockdown fatigue, that parents and other members of the public are tired of staying under lockdown. They want to get out. They want their children to go back to school. They want to get back into work. They want to return to some form of normality. And I don't think he wants to be seen as someone distant from the public, someone who's unfeeling, someone who's rigid. Now, maybe Keir Starmer doesn't want to push too hard one way or the other. Perhaps he's playing the long game here, and he's hoping that Boris Johnson will tie himself up into knots. However, in all honesty, Keir Starmer's performance today was less than perfect, to say the least. And of course, the Tories will always use the boogeyman of the trade unions to beat the public senseless and convince the public that trade unions are working against their interests. This is a common tactic used by the Tories even long before Margaret Thatcher. You see, there is a power struggle taking place at the moment between the trade unions, who are looking after their members, in this case the teachers, and the government, who have realised that they have made a complete arse of this crisis, and instead of stepping back and attempting to fix the problems that they have created, they're attempting instead to weaponize this pandemic against their natural enemies, the trade unions. The entire Tory ethos is to empower the private sector while at the same time weakening the public sector. Why are schools, public schools in the sense of state schools, reopening, while private schools like Eton are being permitted to stay closed? Once again, they are empowering the private sector at the expense of the public sector, in the same way that the NHS will be eventually sold off. It will be demonstrated that the NHS doesn't work, it doesn't function, but the private sector functions perfectly. It's able to fill the gap. But that gap is going to get bigger and bigger, and therefore you will need more and more industry, the private sector, to fill that gap. But in respect to schools, I still believe this is an attempt to force parents to send their children back in order for the parents to return to work and for the economy to start rumbling forward once again. Let me know in the comments, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks. Why not become a Patreon and enjoy access to our Discord server where we share news, chat, and have some fun? If you become a patron, you can also make video suggestions on topics that are important to you. Check it out via the link in the description.